The first time Parkour held the baby gorilla, she didn't cry. She didn't fight. She didn't even try to climb away. She just wrapped both tiny hands around his sleeve and held on like letting go meant disappearing forever. Everyone in the rescue room noticed it. The vet standing near the supply cart. The caretaker who had been trying for 20 minutes to get the cub to accept a warm compress. Even Parkour himself, who had worked in wildlife rescue long enough to know that animals in trauma don't usually choose strangers. They withdraw. They shut down. They go somewhere inside themselves where nothing can reach them. But the moment Parkour's arm came close enough, she grabbed on, and she stopped shaking. Not all the way, not completely, but enough that the room went still, and the vet looked up from her clipboard, and nobody said a word for a few seconds because something had just happened that none of them could fully explain. The cub had been brought in 3 hours earlier, found alone near the edge of a protected forest where the tree line thins out and the human world starts pushing in. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. There had been reports of a disturbance in that area the night before, the kind of disturbance that wildlife teams in that region had learned to recognize without needing details. Her mother was gone. That was the only fact that mattered now. She had been found by a field team at first light, curled against the base of a tree, cold to the touch, her breathing shallow and irregular, small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands though she wasn't newborn. The vet estimated she was somewhere between 4 and 6 months old, which made the situation both better and worse. Old enough to have formed a deep attachment to her mother. Old enough to understand in whatever way infant gorillas understand things, that something was missing that should not be missing. They had wrapped her in a fleece-lined thermal blanket and driven her to the facility without sirens, without sudden movements, without anything that might add more shock to a body that was already carrying more than it should have to carry. By the time Parkour's team received her, she was technically stable. Her heart rate was up, but her temperature was responding to warmth. The dehydration was serious but manageable. The vet had seen worse and said so, which was the closest thing to optimism anyone was going to get in that room. But stable and okay are 2 very different things, and this cub was not okay. For the first hour she refused everything. The staff worked carefully, the way experienced wildlife caretakers do. No loud voices, no sharp movements, no crowding. They kept the lighting low. They played soft ambient sound in the background, something the facility used with traumatized animals to reduce the jarring silence. They offered warm electrolyte formula in the smallest syringe available, the kind designed for animals far younger than her, just in case the reduced size felt less threatening. She turned away from every attempt, not aggressively. She didn't have the energy for aggression. She simply pulled inward, tightening herself into a shape that said, without any words, that she had already decided the world was not safe and she was not going to be convinced otherwise. One of the caretakers, a woman named Rosa who had worked with great apes for 11 years, sat quietly at the far edge of the room and just existed near her for a while. That was sometimes enough. Proximity without pressure, presence without demand. Rosa had seen it work before with animals who had nothing left but the instinct to distrust. It didn't work this time. The cub kept one tiny fist pressed against her own chest, curled tight, like she was still holding on to something that was no longer there. The vet watched that detail carefully. It wasn't a medical symptom, it was a grief gesture, and it told her more about the cub's internal state than any of the vitals on the monitor. Parkour hadn't planned to be the one in the room. He had come in to help move a supply cart to the far corner, something that needed to be done quietly and without disturbing the cub more than necessary. He was focused on the task. He wasn't making eye contact with her, wasn't talking to her, wasn't trying to be part of her story at all in that moment. He crouched down near the edge of her care area to adjust the cart's wheel, and as he reached past the low barrier to steady it, his sleeve passed within a few inches of her hand. She grabbed it, not gently, not tentatively. She grabbed it the way someone grabs a railing on a staircase they're afraid of falling down. Both hands, full grip, immediate and certain, like some part of her had made a decision before the rest of her could argue. Parkour went completely still. He didn't pull back. He didn't lean in. He just stopped moving and let her hold on, and after a few seconds he slowly turned his head to look at her, and she was already looking at him. Dark eyes, exhausted, frightened in a way that went very deep, but not letting go. Rosa looked at the vet. The vet looked at Parkour. Nobody spoke. What happened over the next hour was not dramatic. That is the part that is easy to get wrong when people tell stories like this one. There was no magical moment, no instant transformation, no sudden surge of trust that erased everything she had been through. What happened was smaller than that, and more real. Parkour stayed where he was. He spoke in a low, even voice, not to her specifically at first, just quietly narrating small things to Rosa across the room, keeping his tone steady and calm so that the sound of him became familiar without being directed at her like a pressure. He moved only when he had to, and when he did he moved slowly. He never reached for her. He never tried to adjust her position or encourage her to feed or do any of the things that needed to be done, because he understood instinctively that right now, the only thing that needed to be done was to let her decide that his sleeve was a safe thing to hold on to. She held on for 40 minutes before she let go on her own, and when she did it was only to shift position slightly and then reach back and take hold of his sleeve again. Rosa exhaled quietly from across the room. It was the first time any of them had seen the cub initiate contact since she arrived. Later that night, after the feeding attempts had gone slightly better, not well but slightly better, and slightly better was everything, Parkour sat in a chair near the edge of the care area because the vet had asked him to stay close a little longer. The cub had been moved to a padded enclosure with a thermal nest, and she had been restless since the transfer, searching the space, unsettled by the change even though the change was small. Then she crawled toward the edge of the nest closest to where Parkour was sitting. She reached through the padded barrier. She pressed herself against the side nearest to him. It wasn't playful, there was nothing cute about it yet. It was the behavior of a small animal who had lost the one source of warmth and safety it had ever known, and who had found in a single sleeve and a quiet voice something that did not feel like a threat. She wasn't hugging him because she loved him. She was holding on because she was afraid, and holding on was the only thing she knew how to do. One of the night staff, passing through the room on a routine check, stopped in the doorway for a moment and watched, then said softly, almost to herself, "She thinks he's safe." Nobody argued with that. By morning her vitals were more stable. She had taken a small amount of formula during the night. She had slept for nearly 3 hours without waking in distress, which the vet noted as significant. She was still alive, which 24 hours earlier had not been certain. But before Parkour left that morning, the lead vet pulled him aside. She was not unkind about it. She had done this long enough to know that what had happened overnight was real and that it mattered. But she was also clear. "If she survives because of you," she said, "one day she'll also have to survive without you. And the stronger this bond gets, the harder that's going to be for her. And probably for you too." Parkour nodded like he understood, but standing there in the early morning light, looking back through the window at a cub who was alive because she had decided, for reasons no one could fully explain, to hold on to a stranger's sleeve, he wasn't sure he understood at all. He wasn't sure saving her was going to be the hardest part. He was starting to think letting her go might be. The weeks that followed did not move quickly. That is the nature of real rescue work. There is no montage. There is no moment where the animal suddenly transforms from broken to whole. There is only the slow, unglamorous accumulation of small improvements measured in grams of formula accepted and hours of uninterrupted sleep and the gradual, cautious expansion of what feels safe. The cub, whom the staff had quietly begun calling Mara, not as an official designation but as a practical necessity because you cannot care for something around the clock without giving it a name, began to stabilize in the days following her arrival. Her temperature held steady. Her hydration improved. The vet reduced the frequency of her monitoring checks from every 2 hours to every 4, which in the language of wildlife rehabilitation is a significant vote of confidence. But her emotional recovery moved on a completely different schedule than her physical one, and that was the part nobody could rush. Parkour returned each morning at the same time, not because anyone had officially assigned him to her care. His role at the facility covered a range of responsibilities, and Mara was only one of them. But the staff had noticed what the vet had noticed, and a quiet, unspoken arrangement had developed where Parkour's schedule was loosely shaped around her feeding windows. Nobody made a formal announcement about it. It simply became the way things were, the way practical adjustments often do in small, underfunded rescue operations where everyone is watching what works and trying to do more of it. That was the thing Rosa kept pointing out to the newer staff members who came through the room and watched with curiosity. He didn't reach for Mara, didn't try to hold her, didn't attempt to accelerate the bond by manufacturing closeness. He simply existed in the room with her at the right times, spoke in the same low, even voice she had first heard when she grabbed his sleeve, and let her make every decision about proximity herself. She always moved toward him eventually. Sometimes it took 20 minutes, sometimes less, but she would reposition herself in her enclosure, slowly and with the deliberate caution of an animal that was still not entirely sure the world could be trusted, until she was as close to him as the barrier allowed, and then she would settle. The vet documented it. The staff discussed it in quiet voices during handover. What Parkour had become to Mara was not a caretaker in the traditional sense. He had become something harder to define and more important. He had become the shape that safety took, in her mind, in her body, in whatever part of an infant gorilla processes the difference between danger and calm. Around the third week, her behavior began to change in a way that made everyone smile and worry at the same time. She started reaching for him, not just settling near him, not just tolerating his presence, actively reaching. When Parkour entered the room, Mara would move to the closest point of her enclosure and extend both arms toward him in a gesture that was unmistakable in its meaning. When he sat nearby, she would find a way to position herself against whatever part of him she could access through the barrier. When he stood to leave, she would hold the edge of the enclosure and watch the door he had walked through, sometimes for several minutes, with an expression that the staff had learned not to describe in overly human terms but that was genuinely difficult to look at without feeling something. Rosa raised it at a team meeting without making it dramatic. She laid out what she was observing, used the correct clinical language, and then said plainly that they needed to start thinking carefully about the trajectory. The bond was serving Mara's immediate recovery. That was clear, and it was real, and nobody in the room was dismissing it. But wildlife rehabilitation has a direction, and that direction is always, without exception, away from human dependence. The closer Mara attached herself to one specific person, the more complicated the road ahead was going to become. The vet agreed. She had seen this dynamic before, more times than she liked. An animal saved by human closeness, who then had to be carefully, painfully unwound from that same closeness in order to become what it was supposed to be. It was one of the genuine cruelties built into the work, and there was no clean way around it. Parkour sat in that meeting and listened without saying much. He understood the logic, he had always understood it. But understanding something in your mind, and being prepared for it in your body are not the same thing, and he was beginning to realize that the gap between those two states was wider than he had expected. The reduction process started gently, the way these things have to. The team began introducing more caretakers into Mara's daily routine, making sure she was receiving consistent, calm, positive interactions from multiple people rather than orienting entirely toward one. Rosa took on more of the feeding shifts. A younger staff member named Kwame, who had a naturally quiet manner that animals responded well to, began spending time near her enclosure in the evenings. The ambient sound she was played was shifted slightly, more varied, less uniform, to begin reducing her reliance on specific sensory cues. Parkour's visits were shortened by small increments, 15 minutes less in the morning, a gap introduced in the afternoon window, nothing abrupt, nothing that would register to Mara as abandonment rather than routine adjustment. The team had done this before and they knew that the pacing mattered enormously. Too fast and you destabilize an animal that is still building the basic architecture of trust. Too slow and you entrench a dependency that will cost far more to address later. Mara noticed anyway. The first afternoon that Parkour left earlier than usual, she moved to the door side of her enclosure and stayed there. She accepted her evening feeding from Kwame, which was progress, but she was distracted throughout, her attention drifting toward the entrance with a regularity that was hard to ignore. She slept, but less deeply. The monitors showed more movement during the night than the previous week had recorded. It was not a crisis. The vet was careful to frame it that way. This was an expected response to a necessary change, and the fact that Mara was still eating, still sleeping, still accepting contact from other caretakers, meant that the foundation being built was holding. She was not shutting down the way she had on the first night. She was adjusting, which is a completely different thing even when it looks painful. But watching it was hard. The real shift came quietly, the way most real shifts do. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like a gradual accumulation of small signs that something was changing in the right direction. Mara began acknowledging Kwame when he entered the room, not with the same reaching gesture she used with Parkour, but with attention, with the turning of her body toward him that indicated recognition and the beginning of comfort. She started finishing her feedings more consistently regardless of who was administering them. She began to show the first faint traces of curiosity about her environment, reaching toward objects, examining textures, watching the movement of staff across the room with interest rather than anxiety. And then came the day that Rosa called Parkour about from across the facility. There was a juvenile gorilla at the center, a young male who had been in rehabilitation for several months and was well along in his own recovery process. The team had been considering whether Mara was ready for a careful, supervised introduction, not interaction, not yet, just proximity, just the experience of being near another gorilla, hearing gorilla sounds, registering a gorilla presence without the buffer of human intervention. They set it up carefully, with both animals in separate but adjacent spaces, and staff positioned at every point that mattered. Mara's reaction to the sounds of the other gorilla was sharp at first. She pulled back, her body going tense in the way it had in those first desperate hours, but she didn't retreat to the far corner. She stayed near the shared barrier, and after a while her body language shifted from alarm towards something more like uncertainty, and uncertainty was so much closer to curiosity than fear that the team considered it a genuine milestone. By the end of the session, Mara was sitting near the barrier, not pressed against it, not reaching toward the other gorilla, just sitting near it, parallel, present. Rosa watched and felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. For the first time since Mara had arrived, her world had expanded beyond a single sleeve and the person attached to it. Then came the news that Parkour had been half expecting and half dreading since the vet's warning on that first morning. The lead rehabilitation coordinator called him in and told him, in the measured and professional tone of someone who understood that this was going to be hard to hear, that Mara was ready for the next stage. Not because she still needed more of what the facility had given her, because she had taken enough from it that she could now receive what only a full primate rehabilitation center could provide. The socialization, the gradual reintegration, the long, careful work of becoming a gorilla again in the presence of other gorillas. She was being transferred. Parkour's visits would end. Not permanently, the coordinator was clear about that, but for an initial period, while Mara adjusted to her new environment, contact with people from her rescue phase would be limited and carefully managed. The transition needed space to work, and space meant distance, and distance meant that whatever he had become to her over these weeks would have to hold without reinforcement for a while. He walked back to the care room, stood in the doorway for a moment, and watched Mara sitting in her enclosure. She looked up when she sensed him there. She moved toward the closest point of the barrier and reached in his direction. He smiled at her. Then he walked outside into the afternoon air, sat down on a low concrete barrier near the parking area, and put his head in his hands. He stayed there for a while. Nobody came to check on him, which was its own kind of kindness. The morning of the transfer was overcast. That detail shouldn't matter. It is not the kind of thing that changes what happens or what it means, but Parkour noticed it anyway, the way you notice small things on days that feel larger than their calendar slot, and it stayed with him for a long time afterward, that flat gray light over the facility parking area, as the transport vehicle arrived, and the team began running through the final checklist. He had been told he could be present, not in an active role, not close enough to interfere with the process or give Mara an anchor to resist the transition, but present at a distance, visible if she looked for him, which the coordinator thought might help the initial phase go more smoothly. His presence at the edge of things had always been more useful to Mara than his presence at the center of them. That had been true from the first night. It seemed fitting that it would be true now too. He stood near the far end of the loading area and watched. The team moved Mara with the kind of calm, practiced efficiency that comes from doing difficult things carefully for a long time. Every person in position knew their role. Every movement was deliberate. The travel enclosure was lined with familiar materials, the same fleece texture she had slept against for weeks, a piece of cloth that carried the scent of the care room. These were not sentimentalities. They were tools, chosen because the science of animal stress management is clear that olfactory continuity during transport reduces cortisol response significantly, and a calmer animal arrives at a new environment with more capacity to adjust. Mara was alert during the loading. Her eyes moved across the space in the fast scanning way they did when she was processing something she wasn't sure about. She looked toward Parkour once, one direct, held look across the distance between them. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. He just stayed where he was, and kept his posture open and relaxed, the same way he had held himself on that first night when she grabbed his sleeve and everything changed. Lodi. She looked away. The team completed the loading, the vehicle doors closed, and Parkour stood in the parking area and watched it drive away, and felt the particular silence of a space where something important used to be. There were other animals at the facility with needs that did not pause because one chapter had closed. There were supply inventories, and enclosure maintenance, and a meeting about the facility's funding situation that ran 40 minutes longer than it should have. Parkour moved through all of it the way you move through the practical requirements of a day that feels like it should be something else, but he kept waking up at the same time in the mornings. The time that had been Mara's first feeding window, his body had built a clock around her schedule without his permission, and it did not adjust simply because the schedule had changed. He would come awake in the dark and lie there for a moment before the understanding settled back over him, that she was somewhere else now, in the hands of people who knew what they were doing, in a place that could give her what he never could. The rehabilitation center sent brief reports to the rescue team during the early transition period, which was standard practice. The first one arrived 3 days after the transfer. Mara was eating, slowly and with some reluctance, but eating. She was exploring her new space cautiously. She was startling at unfamiliar sounds. She was watching the doors. That last detail landed harder than the others. Parkour read it and sat with it for a moment, and tried to hold on to the part of himself that knew what she was going through was necessary, that the discomfort of transition is not the same as harm, that every animal that had ever gone through this process had needed exactly this kind of difficult time to begin reorienting toward what came next. He held on to that. He did. But he also wondered. In the private and unguarded way people wonder about things they wouldn't say out loud in a professional setting, whether she was sitting near whatever passed for a door in her new enclosure the same way she had sat near the door of the care room in those early weeks after his visits grew shorter, whether she was waiting for a shape that wasn't coming. But he hoped she wasn't. He couldn't be sure. The second report was better. The third one was better still. Mara had accepted food from 2 of the center's regular caretakers without significant resistance. She had begun moving more freely within her enclosure, which the center's team noted as an indicator of reduced acute stress. She was vocalizing, short, exploratory sounds, nothing distressed, just the ordinary communicative noises of a young gorilla testing her environment. The center's behavioral specialist flagged it as a positive sign. Then came the report that Parkour read 3 times. Mara had been introduced to the adjacent space of the juvenile gorilla group again, carefully, incrementally, with full staff supervision at every point. And during the second session, she had sat near the mesh barrier for an extended period, watching the other gorillas move and interact. At one point, a juvenile female had come close to the barrier from the other side. Both animals had remained there for several minutes, not touching, not vocalizing at each other, just close. The specialist described it as the first evidence of genuine gorilla-directed social interest. Parkour read that phrase and felt something shift in him that he hadn't realized was still wound tight. Not relief exactly, or not only relief, something more complicated. The particular feeling of watching something you care about take a step toward a world that doesn't have you in it, and finding that you are glad even though being glad about it requires accepting that it is true. She was becoming what she was supposed to become. He had known that was the goal from the beginning. He had said it to himself in various forms, more times than he could count. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and feeling it arrive, and it arrived in that moment while he was sitting at his desk reading a behavioral report on his phone, and it was not what he had expected it to feel like. It felt like both grief and gratitude at the same time. 7 months after the transfer, the rehabilitation center contacted the rescue facility with an unusual request. They were planning a carefully supervised visit, not for therapeutic purposes. Mara's progress had been consistent enough that her trajectory was no longer dependent on external support. The center's coordinator was clear about that. This was something different. They had been observing a specific behavioral pattern in Mara during the months since her arrival, a particular quality of response when she encountered objects or scents associated with her early rescue period, and the team wanted to explore whether a controlled reunion with someone from that time would produce measurable behavioral data worth documenting. It was framed clinically, because these things are framed clinically, because that is how science and animal welfare intersect, and because the alternative is the kind of emotionally driven decision-making that can cause harm to animals who deserve better than that. But everyone involved understood what the visit actually was. Parkour was asked whether he would be willing to come. He said yes before the coordinator finished the question. The center briefed him carefully on the drive over. Mara's current behavioral baseline, what had changed in her since arrival, what the staff had learned about her patterns and her responses, and then the coordinator said something that Parkour found himself returning to for the rest of the day. She said that Mara might not respond the way he expected, that animals in rehabilitation changed significantly over months, and the Mara who had held onto his sleeve in a rescue room was not the same animal who had been navigating a complex social environment for 7 months. Her memory was real. Gorilla cognitive science was clear on that. But the way that memory expressed itself, if it expressed itself at all, might look very different from what he remembered. He might walk in and she might show mild interest, and then return to her group. He might walk in and she might not orient toward him at all. He should be prepared for that. He should let that be okay. Parkour said he understood. He wasn't sure he did. The supervised area was a large, naturalistic space, nothing like the small clinical care room where he had first sat beside her with a supply cart and an accidental moment of grace. There were other animals present at a distance. Staff were positioned throughout. The coordinator stood close to Parkour and kept her voice low as they entered, giving him final instructions about body language and movement, and where to stop. Weiji stopped where he was told. He looked across the space. Mara was on the far side, moving with the easy ground-covering knuckle walk of a gorilla who had been getting stronger for months. She was bigger than he had prepared himself for. Not dramatically. She was still young, still a fraction of the size she would eventually become, but bigger than the cub he had last seen watching him from an enclosure doorway through the window of a vehicle. She hadn't seen him yet. Or if she hadn't reacted. He waited. The coordinator said nothing. Then Mara stopped moving. Her head came up. Her body went still in the abrupt total way of an animal that has registered something unexpected. Not alarmed. There was no alarm posture, no bristling, no retreat, just that sudden complete attention that means something has crossed a threshold. She turned toward him slowly. She looked. Parkour stood where he was, his posture open, his hands visible, breathing at the same even pace he had learned to use in a rescue room on the first night she had grabbed his sleeve. The distance between them was perhaps 15 feet. She stared at him across it, and then she began to move. She didn't rush. That was the first thing Parkour noticed. The way she moved toward him was not the frantic, desperate reaching of the cub who had grabbed his sleeve like letting go meant disappearing. It was measured, deliberate, the movement of an animal that was larger now, stronger now, more anchored in herself than she had ever been in that rescue room, and who was choosing, with the full weight of that new solidity, to close the distance between them. The coordinator stayed where she was and said nothing. The other staff held their positions. The space held its breath in the quiet way that rooms hold their breath when something real is happening that nobody wants to interrupt. Mara stopped a few feet from Parkour. She looked at him again, that direct, unhurried gorilla gaze that is nothing like the way humans look at each other, and yet communicates something that is not entirely different. Recognition, processing, the deep, slow work of a brain that is cross-referencing the present moment against something stored a long time ago. Parkour didn't move toward her. He let her have the distance. He let her have the decision. She made it. She came forward the rest of the way and put both arms around him, not rough, not reckless, with the same quiet certainty with which she had moved across the space, deliberate, present, real. She pressed against him the way she had pressed against the side of her enclosure on that first long night, except that the desperation was gone now. What remained was something that had survived the desperation, something quieter, something that did not need to grip so hard because it was no longer afraid of being dropped. One of the staff members near the far wall turned away for a moment. The coordinator, who had been in this field long enough that very little surprised her, stood very still and watched and did not say anything at all. Parkour closed his eyes. He didn't try to analyze what was happening. He didn't run through the behavioral science or the clinical terminology or the carefully worded reports that had tracked Mara's progress over 7 months. He just stood there in a large, naturalistic enclosure in the middle of a working day and let himself be held by a gorilla who had no reason to remember him and had remembered him anyway. After a few moments she let go. She stepped back, looked at him once more, and then turned and moved back toward the interior of the space, toward the other animals, toward the world that was hers now. She did not look back. The coordinator walked over to Parkour and stood beside him for a moment. Then she said, in the practical and unsentimental tone of someone who has worked a long time at the intersection of science and something that science does not fully have words for, that what they had just witnessed was consistent with what the research literature described as long-term associative memory in great apes, that the olfactory and visual cues Parkour carried had almost certainly been stored and retained by Mara across the months of separation, that her approach, behavior, and contact initiation were well within the expected range for a gorilla with a positive early attachment history, expressing recognition of a familiar individual. Parkour nodded. Then he said quietly, "She's okay." The coordinator looked at him. "She's better than okay," and she left it there, because sometimes that is enough. The visits became a documented part of Mara's ongoing care record. Not frequent. The center was careful about that, and Parkour understood the carefulness without needing it explained. Too much, too often, and you begin undoing the work that had taken so long to build. The goal was never to keep Mara tethered to her rescue story. The goal had always been to give her enough of a foundation that her rescue story became a beginning, rather than the whole of what she was. But a few times a year, when the conditions were right, and the timing worked, and the center's team determined that a supervised visit would not disrupt Mara's social integration, Parkour would make the drive and walk into that space. And every time, the pattern was the same. She would be somewhere across the enclosure, engaged in whatever occupied her, moving, resting, existing in the unhurried way of an animal that had found its footing in the world. She would not see him immediately, or if she did, she would not react immediately, and there were always a few seconds of uncertainty during which Parkour would stand where he was told to stand and wonder, quietly, whether this would be the time she didn't come. She always came, that same stillness first, the sudden stop, the head coming up, the body going quiet in a way that was different from rest, then the slow turn, then the recognition moving across her in something that was not a human expression, and was not nothing either, then the approach measured and certain, crossing the distance between them with the easy confidence of an animal who knew where she was going, and then the hug, always the hug, not theatrical, not performed for anyone watching, just the genuine physical expression of whatever lives in a gorilla's memory when memory decides that a particular presence means safety. She would hold on for a few seconds, sometimes longer, never in a way that seemed distressed, always in a way that seemed chosen, and then she would release, and step back, and look at him once, and go. The going was the part that had taken Parkour the longest to understand fully. In the early visits, some part of him had still been watching for it with a kind of brace, the way you brace when you expect something to hurt. But over time he had learned to see it differently. The going was not a withdrawal, it was not an ending, it was the proof that everything they had done had worked, that Mara was not returning to him because she was still the cub who needed a sleeve to hold on to, but because she had become something whole enough to choose contact freely and then return to her own life afterward. The hug was not dependence, it was memory, and memory in this case was kindness given shape. Years passed in the way that years pass when you are doing work that matters, and the days are full. Mara grew into herself gradually, the way gorillas do, not in the sudden dramatic way of animals that mature quickly, but in the slow accumulating way of a creature whose full development takes a long time and is richer for it. She became more confident in her social group. She established her own patterns, her own relationships, her own particular way of navigating the dynamics of the world she lived in. The behavioral reports that Parkour still occasionally received described an animal that had integrated well, that showed no significant markers of her early trauma in her day-to-day functioning, that was, in the language of the field, thriving. He read those reports with a feeling he had gotten better at naming over the years. It was not pride exactly, because she had done the hard work herself, had carried herself through the fear and the separation and the long process of becoming what she was, but it was adjacent to pride. It was something in the family of pride. The last visit Parkour made to the center in the story's reckoning was on a clear day. Nothing dramatic about the weather this time, just ordinary light falling across the enclosure in the way that ordinary light does. Mara was larger than the first reunion, substantially. The passage of years was evident in her size, in the authority of her movement, in the way the younger animals in her group oriented around her without her having to do anything to make them do it. She was not the cub anymore in any sense that was visible from the outside. Whatever remained of that animal existed only in the interior architecture of her, in the place where early experience lives in every creature and shapes what they become, long after the shaping itself is forgotten. Parkour waited where he was told to wait. She found him the same way she always found him, that stillness first, then the turn, then the slow deliberate crossing of the space between them. She was too large now for the contact to look the way it had looked in the early years. Everything was scaled differently, her reach, her weight, the way her presence registered in the space, but the gesture was the same, both arms forward, around him. She held on for a moment. Parkour stood in it, and thought about the rescue room, and the supply cart, and the sleeve, and the first night she had decided, for reasons that no one could fully explain, that he was safe. He thought about the vet's warning on that first morning. He thought about Rosa's quiet exhale when Mara had initiated contact for the first time. He thought about a transfer vehicle pulling away in flat gray light, and a desk and a phone and a behavioral report he had read 3 times. He thought about the word thriving. Then Mara let go, stepped back, looked at him with those dark, unhurried eyes that had looked at him across the years in all their different versions of this moment. And then she turned and walked back toward her group, back toward the life that was hers, back toward the world she had learned, slowly and at great cost, to inhabit without fear. He had first held her when she was small enough to fit in the space between his arm and his body. When she was that small, she held on because she was afraid of what letting go would mean. Years later, she still wrapped her arms around him when he came, but she held on differently now, without urgency, without desperation, the way you hold on to something that you are glad still exists in the world, and then release it because you also know how to be glad without holding. He had helped save her when she was too small and too broken to save herself. She had grown into something he couldn't have imagined on that first night in that rescue room, when saving her felt like the whole of the task. He understood now that saving her had only been the beginning. The rest, all of it, the learning and the fear and the long work of becoming whole that had been hers. Look, he had just been the sleeve she held onto until she was ready to let go.